This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journeys toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 237 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with FAT+ve fertility coach and author Nicola Salmon about common myths about fertility, food, and weight, how to advocate for your health needs, the real reason why IVF clinics have BMI cutoffs, tips for preparing for pregnancy if you're in a larger body, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. But first, a quick note that this episode was recorded before the whole COVID-19 pandemic. So that's why we don't talk about it at all in this interview. And we're running it now because we thought this week was Infertility Awareness Week, but it actually turns out that it was last week. And we didn't catch that because things are just chaos with the global pandemic and my life and everything else. But whatever week it is, no matter what, this is a great episode and a great interview for anyone who's struggling with fertility or who's thinking about trying to get pregnant or trying to get pregnant currently, as well as people with loved ones who are in any of those boats. Now, that all being said, this week's listener question is from the pandemic era. And I've been fast-tracking COVID-19 related questions during this time so that I can help answer the stuff that's coming up for you all now that feels really pressing when this pandemic situation is happening. But I do eventually plan to go back and answer some of the older questions. So if you had an older question that you asked, I still may get to it down the line. This week, my answer is going to be a little more of a rough draft or rough sketch than usual because I've honestly had a really intense week or couple of weeks. I had a sinus infection that I was worried was COVID-19 and thankfully wasn't. And I'm on antibiotics and it's been responding to that. And I'm feeling much better, but still a little run down after like 4 or 5 days of antibiotics. I've also been working nonstop on that op-ed that I was talking about last week that finally just came out today in Wired. And I'm so happy with it and just happy with everything that I was able to push back on, all the myths about, BMI and COVID-19. But it was so much time that I had to spend knee deep in really fat-phobic research. And I think that, mentally was just exhausting. And then just last night, I'm already recording this later than I usually do with these intros and outros, and just last night, a close family friend whom I've known since childhood passed away from the virus. So I'm just honestly really wiped out and kind of not at my best right now. So I'm going to just try and do my best, and hopefully I can offer a little help and support with this answer. So with all of that, this week's question is from a listener named Siobhan, who writes, "Hi, Christy. Due to the pandemic, I had to abruptly leave my partial hospitalization program. I've been struggling on and off with anorexia all my life and have been inpatient a few times. I'm fortunate enough to have a great outpatient team, but I'm really sliding into my strange restrictive thoughts. I'm so ashamed of this that I can only talk very little about this with my therapist and dietitian. I find all this talk about food hoarding, diminished food supply chains, ways to cook at home, etc., immensely triggering. I'm a mom of 3 kids and I'm a proficient home chef, but all this food obsession by our news is really getting to me. I spend most of my days trying to procure and create healthy meals for my family, but I definitely have crossed into disordered thoughts and fears for myself. Going to grocery stores and farmers markets sends me into a panicked, anxious state. Seeing my fridge heaving with food, or worse, getting barer by the day, is also so anxiety-provoking. What can I do to stay well and yet still be the main food person for my family? So thanks, Siobhan, for that great question. And before I answer, just my standard disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So first of all, Siobhan, I just want to send you so much compassion, and really to anyone who's in this boat, and let's be honest, to everyone listening to this, because we're all in a difficult boat, right? So sending you so much compassion, but especially for someone who is in eating disorder treatment, really needs to be in a higher level of care and just isn't because of the pandemic, this is especially difficult. This time is especially difficult. And so I want to say you don't need to be ashamed of having those restrictive thoughts and anxieties come up. So many people are going through this. So many people are struggling right now. And I'm sure that right now, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people have just heard your question and heard themselves in your question. So you are not alone. And given that this is such a common struggle, I want to just reassure you that your therapist and your dietitian are not going to be shocked or judgmental or any of those things that you might be fearing they might be. Like keeping this from them, I'm sure, is because you're worried about how they're going to react. But I want to reassure you that their reaction is not going to be like that. I think they'll be very understanding because so many people are going through the same thing right now, and I'm sure they've seen it before. So I would really encourage you to open up to your treatment team about this and get more ongoing support, because that's what they're there for. They're there to help you through this, and really rely on them and trust them and lean on them in this period, because it is difficult and you can't do this alone and you shouldn't have to. Now, you say that you spend most of your days trying to procure and create healthy meals for your family. And while I know that procuring and making food is definitely harder than usual right now with this pandemic, I also know that thinking about food and making food and creating meals doesn't need to be taking up that much time. It doesn't need to be taking up most of your days. I think that's a lot of space that food is taking up in your mind and in your life. And that's a clue that your eating disorder and its diet culture mentality are really robbing you of life. And you deserve so much better. You deserve a life where you're not fixated on food and thinking about food and worried about whether it's quote unquote healthy all the time, most of the day. You really deserve to have most of your day devoted to other things and a little bit of time devoted to preparing and procuring food, even if you are the main food person in your family. And that brings me to another point, which is that being the main food person in your family, I think, is probably hugely challenging right now. Now, you didn't mention having a partner, so I don't know if there's someone else at home, another adult that can help you out, but I wonder if there's something you can do to get some more support and more help at home to deal with some of the food stuff. And maybe that even looks like enlisting your kids, if they're old enough, to help out with the cooking, help out with some shopping, because it's really a lot to try to be the main food person in your family when you're trying to recover from an eating disorder. And again, especially when you really need to be in a higher level of care, like the partial hospitalization program that you were in, and the only reason you had to leave was because of the pandemic. So I really don't think you're in a position where anyone can expect you to be the main food shopper and preparer in your family without it having serious negative repercussions for you. And I know the pandemic is really forcing us to sometimes do things out of necessity. So it may be that if you're a single mom, it all falls on your shoulders, and I get that. But I still think that there are ways to ask for and get help from other people so that you're not the only one having to do this. So depending on how old your kids are, they may not necessarily be able to help much with cooking or shopping, or they might if they're old enough. But I bet that with 3 kids, there is at least one of them who is old enough to write. So maybe one way that you could get some support and help from them is just to have them make a list of the foods they want to help you prepare for shopping. So just outsourcing and delegating a little bit of that work around what to actually buy, and getting the kids involved and letting them pick some fun foods that they really like. And of course, you're probably going to have to fill in other foods that they didn't put on their list, but at least that would help you get a start if you can allow them to pick some foods that they like. And I think that would also be really helpful for them in their relationships with food to have some agency of putting things on the list. Or if your kids are old enough, maybe you can divide up the list at the store and have them get some things while you get other things. I know that when I was growing up and got to a certain age, I don't know, maybe it was like 10 or 12 or something like that, my mom would like tear off a part of the list and have me go get some groceries just to help out and make it go faster. And if you have a partner who lives with you, partner at home, now is very much the time, I would say, to delegate, to ask for help, to explain to your partner why this is a really difficult time to be the primary food person and that you need some support from them because you're struggling with an active eating disorder. And this is just incredibly triggering. And if you don't have a partner at home, maybe you do have a friend or a loved one who either lives with you, maybe a roommate or someone outside your household who'd be willing to shop for you. If you could tell them kind of generally the ballpark of things that you need and give them some money to get it for you and have them leave groceries on your doorstep or something. I know a lot of families who are doing that right now for elderly family members, maybe who can't get to the store, for people who are disabled and can't shop as easily. Having other family members or friends and loved ones who can go and do that shopping for you and then just leave the groceries for you is a huge, huge help. So think about anyone in your life that you can enlist for help like that, whether it's a partner at home, whether it's your kids, whether it's outside friends and family members, all of the above, and get some support because it really sounds like this is so much falling on your shoulders at a time when you're really vulnerable. Like you really need to be in eating disorder treatment much more full-time than you are. And so having this much of your day devoted to dealing with food, I think is really difficult. I feel like that's difficult for anyone to be like the primary food person in a family with 3 kids. That's a lot of work anyway, and especially during a global pandemic. But then add to that you have this current eating disorder going on. And I just think that is too much. You're just taking on so much. And I understand why you're struggling. So those are just a couple of ideas for how you might try to make things easier on yourself. I hope that can be helpful. And one other thing to do that I think is helpful in general is just to turn off the news or change the channel when the food stuff comes up or when anything that's potentially triggering to you comes up. I know it's so hard to constantly see this stuff, and you don't have to sit there and take it. I know it's important to be informed. I know we all want to watch the news, but there's a point at which it becomes unhelpful. And I think that, these stories about like how to shop and cook for food or showing empty pantry aisles and grocery stores and talking about that or whatever it might be, that stuff can be really anxiety producing and there's not a lot of benefit that you actually get from it. Especially in your case, it sounds like that stuff is only harmful right now. So please turn it off, change the channel, get it out of your face in whatever way you can. I know it's impossible, of course, to avoid like catching even little bits of it, but the more you can practice noticing and setting a boundary around that and saying, nope, not today, news, I'm going to click away from you or whatever, the more you'll be protecting your mental health and the more you'll be helping yourself weather this storm that is this whole situation that's so hard for all of us. So hopefully that's helpful. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to have me answer multiple questions every month, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. I've talked about this course here a lot, but it's a really great resource for people who are struggling right now. It has a monthly Q&A podcast just for participants where you can ask me your own questions every month, have me answer them, and listen to hundreds of other questions I've given to people already. And it also has 13 modules of audio and written content that are all pre-recorded and you can listen at whatever pace you like. And you get lifetime access to all this material so you can really do it at your own pace and come back to it whenever you need it. And you get a private community forum that is just for course participants so that you can have daily, more real-time guidance from me, my team, and hundreds of other awesome people who are in the course and on the anti-diet path with you. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. It's a great companion to this podcast because it goes into so much depth about diet culture and the ways that it harms us, and it has tons of scientific references and resources to help you really get your head around the anti-diet philosophy and make the anti-diet case to people in your life so that you can get more support in real time, in real life. It also lays out the foundation for intuitive eating and helps you start making peace with food and your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. That's christyharrison.com/book. And by the way, if you've read the book already and you loved it, as I know so many people have done and shared with me on social media and by email and stuff, I'm so grateful for that. And I would be really psyched if you could leave an Amazon review, and also marking the other 5-star reviews is helpful. Those reviews help more people discover the book, which helps grow the anti-diet movement and ultimately helps make this world a safer place for people of all shapes and sizes, including the very largest sizes. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Nicola Salmon. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
So my mum had a very restrictive relationship with food growing up. So for me, I kind of saw that from a really young age. And then I really kind of began to notice that I had a restrictive relationship with food as my mum was kind of influencing that for me. The first memory I have around food is being at my grandparents' house, and they used to look after us after school sometimes as my mum was working. And I remember them giving me a different snack option than my sister had, so a lower calorie crisp, because they felt like my weight needed changing or that I was getting bigger as I was kind of entering puberty, because I had a younger sister who was in a smaller body. And I always remember distinctly that difference between us. So she was allowed to have the crisps I really wanted, and I had to have this other option of something that I didn't really want because it was lower in calories. And it was just really sneaky things like that to begin with. And then I think it was around kind of 16 that I was diagnosed with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. And I was told by my doctor that I needed to go on the pill and that I probably wouldn't have kids, and that the only thing that I could do to support it or to cure myself to get better was to lose weight. So that's when it kind of really ramped up. And that's when I started going to kind of diet clubs with my mum, and we did Weight Watchers, we did Slimming World, we did exercise classes together. And that's kind of when my disordered eating really became, kind of took over my life and became everything that my energy was focused on, getting to a smaller body and losing weight and being in a smaller body. It was all around the fact that I was ill, that I was different, that I had to kind of cure this PCOS because something was wrong with me. And it really had a huge impact on my self-esteem and to choices I made around relationships. And looking back now, I can see it had such an impact on my mental health as well, but I didn't really know it at the time. My grades suffered. So I noticed around that time, I found school much more difficult. And it really affected such a huge area of my, it had fingers in every single pie in all the different areas of my life. The impact of feeling like I had to lose weight and make my body smaller.
It does. It really takes away so much life, and especially doing it so young. It sounds like you missed out on a lot of childhood and adolescence from having to just be so preoccupied with dieting.
I mean, it really, every social occasion, even at that young age, it was like, oh, can I eat that? Should I be eating that? What are people going to think of me? It really kind of took up every thought, and every event in my life that should have been exciting and interesting and wonderful was kind of taken up with these thoughts around, what are people going to say if I eat this? And should I really be having that? And all these other things that kind of just go round and round my head.
And it sounds like you really thought it was your fault at the time, like that it was your responsibility to control your size and shape, that you were uniquely wrong and bad for having a larger body. And it sounds like no one in your life was a voice of health at every size or fat positivity. That just didn't really exist for you at the time.
Not at all. I mean, it wasn't until the past couple of years that I even knew what haze meant. It was such a revelation. But yeah, for me, I always saw my mum trying to make her body smaller and it being such a source of shame when she was in a bigger body. And it was up to me to do every single thing I possibly could to make my body smaller.
And it sounds like your mom probably applauded you and supported you in weight loss because that's what she thought was a good thing to do. That's what she knew. So she was trying to do the right thing by pushing you into it as well.
Definitely. I mean, her intentions were so good in trying to support me to be my healthier self and trying to get rid of all these symptoms I was experiencing with PCOS. So I had acne and excess hair and obviously the weight and the irregular periods. So it was kind of, she wanted me to be in the healthiest way that I could be. And obviously with the doctor saying, lose weight is the only thing that you can do for PCOS, then that was the focus. That was the main driver. So all of this stuff kind of rolled into one. And I've spoken to my mum about it since. And she was, because I've written a little bit about my history in the book that I wrote, and she read it, she was so upset that she kind of felt that maybe she caused it or it was her fault in some way. But when we kind of dug a little bit deeper into that, we realized that there was so much of her own story from when she was younger that she remembered about being shamed for her body and how that impacted her and her growing up. So it's just this whole ancestral layer of how it's being passed on from one generation to the next.
And it's so important to have that compassion too, right? To say, it's not her fault and she was just doing the best she could. And she had so much of her own baggage, like you said, that was passed from one generation to the next. And that's in a lot of ways how diet culture is transmitted, right? It's this intergenerational transmission of trauma, really. It's intergenerational transmission of diet culture beliefs and values that shape how we see the world and how we see our bodies and ourselves. And until we intervene and see things a different way, we can't know what we don't know. And so we kind of just perpetuate that trauma again and again.
Yeah. And of course, when we were younger, the world looked so different. Like my mum was in a small village community where all the young mums who she was socializing with were doing the same thing. They were all going to the same fitness classes. And it was a real kind of fishbowl community of where everybody knew everybody and everybody else's business. And it really feels like that now with social media, but I can't even imagine living my life in that kind of community these days. It's such a shift.
Yeah, she didn't really see anything outside of that at all. It was just, this is what everybody does.
That's it.
Oh, so it sounds like a really fraught childhood and adolescence with food and body stuff.
For me, it didn't really feel different at the time. It's really strange looking back on it now because it was just my normal. So it didn't feel wrong or it didn't feel traumatic, but with kind of fresh eyes that I can see it back now, I just feel so sorry for little Nicola. I just, want to give her a big hug because the stuff that she had to move through and deal with and have to process at such a young age, it just feels too young to be having to work through all that.
Yeah, so young. And I want to give her a hug too. Sounds like you went through a lot as a kid. So how did it go from there then? What happened in your relationship with food as you started to come into your own, become an adult?
So I went to university, moved away from home when I was 18, and that was a real eye-opener for me because it was the first time that I'd ever had kind of free reign over the food that I chose and really what I could eat any time. And I have so many vivid memories of the really strange concoctions that I'd come up with in my kitchen because I really wasn't a very good cook. I remember a specific incident of buying meatballs in a can because I thought that was how you cooked meatballs, and just really so many things. But it was exciting for me because it felt like I could eat anything and everything and nobody was going to tell me not to do it. And so initially it was really exciting and like a freedom. But then kind of once I'd made friends in university, again, it felt like, oh, I've got to conform to these standards and these ideals of what my body should look like. So again, it became this kind of yo-yo of up and down and forever having to try and chase this body ideal. So it was still a constant of looking for the next thing and then succeeding for a little bit and then failing and then looking for the next thing. And that just became a whole cycle in my life throughout my 20s until it wasn't until I actually had children that I really questioned, what am I doing with my time? Is this really what I want to spend the next 20 years doing? And it really kind of brought it home to me. I was like, I just physically can't do this anymore because it's so exhausting. And as a mother of young children, I just could not see how I was gonna make my body smaller when I was so exhausted from, like having babies and, just breastfeeding and all this stuff going on in my life. I was like, I don't have the energy to chase this anymore. So what are the options instead? What can I do that's going to support me, and how am I going to exist in a bigger body when I'm not trying to lose weight?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too that you ended up having children with PCOS and having been told that maybe you wouldn't be able to, and finding a partner as well, and that whole piece. I'm curious how that all unfolded for you, because I think so much of that flies in the face of the mythology that we're told about body size.
Yeah. I mean, I remember from my teens and my early 20s that finding a relationship was really hard for me because I didn't feel worthy of being in a relationship. I didn't feel worthy of being loved. So whenever I was in a relationship, I was very needy and I became a different person because I felt like I had to be something else. I had to make up for the fact that I had a bigger body and be extra this and be extra that and try and be something I wasn't, because I thought that people were like feeling pity for me because I was in a bigger body and they were like settling. So that kind of really affected most of my relationships until I met my current partner now. And then I think it was just at a time in my life when I was maybe growing up a little bit and, finding other interests. And yeah, I don't really know what the difference was with this relationship, but instantly it felt different and we came more at it at an equal footing. And he was able to kind of calm those insecurities and those feelings of being unlovable, and just made me feel safe in a way that other relationships hadn't, which was so powerful. And then we got married, and it was when we were starting to kind of think about the idea of trying to get pregnant that, we'd already had conversations about how it was going to be difficult, and I was still cycling really irregularly, kind of 100+ days cycles normally. And I got pregnant, and it was just it was a real shock because I was expecting it to be the whole huge battle. I knew a little bit about fertility and IVF because I was an acupuncturist at the time, training in fertility. So I was really gearing up for this huge battle of, okay, well, I'm going to have to go through this procedure and that procedure and do this and do that. And I was also kind of gearing up for the next big diet, feeling like getting pregnant, this goal of getting pregnant was going to be the biggest driver. And of course, it was going to make the most difference because this is what I wanted more than anything in the world. And it was going to be the thing that was going to help me to lose weight and keep it off. And
The magic diet.
that's it. I was like, I'm just going to find this last one and it's going to be brilliant. But I got pregnant and I was petrified because I thought that everything was going to go wrong. And that's the stories that I heard around me the whole time through my pregnancy, that you're going to get this is going to go wrong. And I was just so afraid of every single step, something going wrong and something happening to this pregnancy, because I was afraid of my body and I was afraid of the harm that it was potentially going to cause to my child because of the stories that I was told time and time again about how dangerous my body was.
God, that's so painful. And yeah, it makes an already fraught experience of pregnancy, which I think it's normal for people to feel anxiety about it and want to make sure things are okay and don't go wrong. But then there's this huge added layer of blame being put on you. Like your body is at fault.
And every appointment, they were asking me to kind of get on the weighing scales. How much have you eaten? How much weight have you put on? All this stuff of like extra layers of shame and extra ways that I could feel bad about myself. And, I didn't need that stuff because I was already telling myself this stuff every day. And it was a really scary experience, and one that I was so looking forward to enjoying, but it was quite scary. But the really big turning point in my pregnancy was I decided that I wanted to have a home birth. And this was a big no-no. Like, you are not supposed to want to have a home birth in a bigger body. And it's really the first time that I'd ever kind of looked into research around, what are the risks and what does it mean and what would it look like if I was to have this? And it's the first time that I stood up and I said, look, this is what I want. This is the research that I have to support me. And how are we going to make this happen? And it was such a revelation to be able to stand up and say that to a healthcare practitioner, the head midwife. And she agreed, she let me go through with it. And it didn't end up happening because of other things that happened during the birth. But to be able to stand up and say something like that, because I've just been the good girl my whole life. I've been trying to apologize for my body and make up for the fact that I was fat. And then to be able to do this for my body, and just be able to stand up and say, this is what I want, was such a powerful moment in my life. And so something that's just stuck with me since.
Well, I'm curious too to hear how your work as an acupuncturist kind of tied in with all of that and how you got curious and led into the health field yourself.
So I started training as a scientist at uni and then trained as a clinical scientist with my master's. And then when I was living in London, working at a hospital at the time, somebody got shot outside my flat. And because of that, I suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I tried kind of all the conventional medications, all the conventional treatments, but nothing really helped me until I went into a therapy room and just said, what do you recommend? This is what I'm going through. This is what I need support with. And they recommended acupuncture. I'd never had it before. I'd never had any kind of natural treatments before. But it had such a huge impact on me kind of over the 6 weeks that I had treatment that kind of the scientist in me was like, well, how does this work? What is going on? How is this possible? So I signed up to train as an acupuncturist for 4 years. It was a really crazy thing to do and not something I was expecting to do. But I did that. I trained as a naturopath at the same time. And yeah, once I'd qualified, I was really interested in hormones and things because of my own PCOS. That's really what I'd wanted to specialize in. So I did some kind of post-training specialism in fertility. I became a fertility acupuncturist. And it was from that work that I realized that there was a huge emotional component missing from my work, and I could do so much more for people in between sessions with some extra training. So that's when I trained as a fertility coach. So I kind of had all these different tools and then was working with people just in the general fertility world. And then once I'd woken up and found the Health at Every Size movement and the fat positivity movement, I was like, oh my gosh, this is great for me. It was so healing for me and so supportive for me, but this is phenomenal. And how is this not, how is nobody talking about this in the fertility world when there is rife with diet culture? Like there are so many fertility diets and fertility foods. And it's when you start to Google, like, what can I do to improve my fertility? There is so much rubbish that comes up and BS, and it's just like, oh my God, this is terrifying. The more I went into it, the more I realized that, these people are just being left. They're being shamed, judged on their weight, and then being said, okay, well, you just need to lose weight before we can help you anymore. And for me, kind of expecting that to happen to me, I realized that, that could have been me. And it just made me realize that I needed to do something because I was in a position where I didn't have to have that battle, and I had the energy to be able to have that battle on behalf of other people. So I didn't feel prepared. I didn't feel ready, but I thought I've just got to stand up and start helping these people in whatever way I can.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge rabbit hole when people start looking at fertility and what to eat for fertility and all the diets that are out there that say, cut out this food and that food, and this is probably harming you, or lose weight in order to improve your fertility. There's just no good evidence behind any of it. It's just a bunch of BS.
It's so restrictive, the diets that they'll have people going on. And it makes me so mad because there are people profiting off this. And like you say, there's just no research to support it. And I can understand, this is one area of their life they feel that they can control when like fertility is such this huge thing that they have no control over. But it just gives people this false promise that this is going to make a difference when we know that, your lifestyle choices compared to everything else has a really small percentage of impact on your health when you look at your genetics and your social economic status. And, it's such a bigger picture than what you're putting in your mouth and how you're moving your body.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to dig into that a little bit, the sort of myths about fertility that you see out there and how you push back on those and how you teach people how to separate out the bullshit from the real stuff, the real science.
There is so much research out there now because the fertility industry has become an industry. It's not just a healthcare profession these days, because so many people have to access it kind of out of pocket and the insurance doesn't cover it and it's so restricted. So it has grown into this huge kind of beast of an industry where people are there to make a profit and people are there to sell their services. I mean, in terms of myths, there is, so many restriction myths. So you need to cut out the gluten and you need to cut out the dairy and you cut out the sugar, the classic kind of restrictive diets. But like you say, there's just no evidence to support them. And then, the whole kind of worms around percent weight loss will improve your fertility. Again, there's no dose-dependent research that shows that any type of weight loss is going to have an impact or what percentage of an impact it will have on your fertility.
I think that's so key to this idea of like the weight loss supposedly having an impact on your fertility, but we don't know what percentage. We don't have a known way of making people lose weight long-term or sustainably or in a health-promoting way. In fact, it just puts people at greater risk of weight cycling and increases weight stigma, which we know are independent health risk factors. And so telling people to lose weight, even if there was research showing that people in smaller bodies tend to get pregnant more easily or quickly, which I don't know, we can talk about that too, what the research actually says on that. But even if there was research saying that, we still would not have a way to shrink people's bodies in a way that was not harmful. So it doesn't really matter what the research says, actually.
Yeah, because there's no way that we're going to be able to support these people in a way that they're going to get to that weight. It's just crazy.
Yeah. So what does the research say in terms of the correlation versus causation stuff? Is there a correlation between higher weight and more difficulty conceiving, for example, or more, greater rates of infertility? And if so, what is that about? What can explain it other than the weight caused it, which we know is not true?
I mean, there is a correlation between higher weights and an increase of subfertility in irregular ovulation. And that is linked in with PCOS. So one of the parts of PCOS is that bodies tend to get bigger, and to do with the increased insulin resistance, bodies tend to put on weight. So there is a correlation with higher bodied weights have this issue more. But again, it's a correlation. It doesn't mean that the higher weight of the body is causing the problems with ovulation. It's just that those two things are both caused by the same root issue of, the PCOS and what's going on with that.
Right. So the PCOS is the root cause, not the weight is the cause of the fertility issues. It's like the PCOS has as a symptom or a side effect weight gain, and also the PCOS has as a symptom or side effect, and ovulation or subfertility.
That's it completely. And for so many people, it's, well, your weight has caused it. And if you just lose the weight, then your PCOS will magically be fixed, which we know is not true.
Right. And trying to lose the weight oftentimes ends up resulting in worse health, like greater disordered eating. We know weight cycling puts a lot of stress on the body, and that can increase people's levels of, inflammatory markers and increase people's risk of heart disease and other health issues. The weight cycling could also account for a lot of that, right?
And the weight stigma too. We know that people who are suffering with weight stigma, that can increase their inflammation again, which can then go on to increase and exacerbate the problem. So for people in bigger bodies, there are so many more factors going on that people really aren't taking into consideration when they're doing their research.
That's the thing, right? The research is so steeped in diet culture. That's the world that researchers grow up in too. Researchers are people too, and they're making interpretations based on what they believe from diet culture, not with a blank slate of okay, we see this correlation. What could be a potential cause that is not rooted in fat phobia?
And it's so hard to kind of decipher that when you're kind of, I've got books and books of these fertility and quote unquote obesity issues, and reading through those research papers is it's so hard to unpick the actual facts of what's going on and take away kind of all the the assumptions that they've made around fatness and around, people automatically means that this is about them, and all these assumptions that they're assuming about these people. It's really difficult to kind of get to the bottom of kind of what's going on for these people.
Well, it's interesting too, like thinking about your experience of pregnancy and how you got pregnant naturally without having a regular cycle, right? Having like 100+ day cycle. You wouldn't think that that's a recipe for the greatest fertility, but it still happened. So it's you were sort of the unexpected. There's no real accounting for that, right? Of how that happened.
Exactly. And, that was the first seed that kind of planted this idea in my head of like, well, what if this is all just rubbish? Because, having 100+ day cycles, I wasn't tracking at the time. I didn't even really know much about tracking. So there was no way I was timing it. It just happened.
Like tracking when you're ovulating or whatever.
Yeah.
Which, I know a lot of people do that for pregnancy.
That's it. And it really was this happy coincidence. And I wish that for everybody, of course, but that was the thing that really planted the seed in like, well, if it happened for me when I was in this bigger body and having these crazy cycles, why are we telling people that surely I can't just be a 1 in a million and this just happened to happen? Why do we have these ideas that A, it's going to be harder in the first place for people who want to get pregnant in bigger bodies, and B, that it's really just wrong for them to do this and they're going to be harming their children. And, there's so many reasons I hear from people as to why their doctors aren't allowing them to get support and get treatments and tests. It's that it's unethical for them to do it because it's more difficult. And then there's risks in pregnancy, and then there's risks to their birth, and then there's risks to their unborn children. And there's so many layers to this that they go into, that these people just feel broken when they leave these appointments because, of course, they don't want to harm their unborn children's health. Of course, they don't want to cause unnecessary risks during their pregnancy, but they aren't giving them the full picture so that they can make this informed consent.
Right, because having an increased risk of whatever the poor outcome might be doesn't get at what's the actual cause. And we see that people in larger bodies have increased risks of all kinds of things, not due to their body size, but due to weight stigma, weight cycling, other factors that might be going on in their life, such as PCOS, that might have as a side effect weight gain and doesn't have anything to do with the weight, why they're having whatever health outcome they're having. It's just the weight gain was a side effect of that underlying condition. And so, it's not giving people that complete picture. But then I feel like the sort of risk fear mongering, the excessive caution by physicians about this, or healthcare professionals in general about this, leads people to, it's weight stigmatizing. It leads people to feel worse about themselves, to feel more broken, like you said, which then increases their chances of having poor health outcomes and potentially makes it less likely to be able to get pregnant too, via that stress cycle that we know weight stigma puts people into.
It's just a vicious cycle. Like the more and more these people tell them that they can't get pregnant, the more they believe that. And like you say, it's just adding this stress and this, people just are experiencing so many mental health problems then because of this, because they feel that they're not able to get pregnant. And this is really all they want to do at this point in their lives. And it's just a horrible, horrible negative loop. And they feel so irresponsible for even wanting to go down that path. And the shame and the judgment that these people feel is just on top of kind of the shame and the judgment they felt in their bigger bodies, and then not being able to have children and not being able to provide that for their partner and their family, and, extends into their whole social circle and family, is this idea that they can't then have a child. And it goes everywhere. It's even in the kind of adoption world. So these people then look into adoption if they can't get pregnant naturally, and there's BMI limits around that. It's scary.
It's horrifying that it's basically people in larger bodies are effectively being barred from being parents in a lot of ways. And that's not okay. That's basically eugenics, which is completely unethical. It's not okay that we should be creating these barriers, or that our system should be creating these barriers. Wow. the other thing too is, I see a lot of times, and I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with this as well, and would love to hear your thoughts, but I've seen people who are trying to get pregnant who come to me wanting to work on healing their relationships with food. And they're thinking, I'm having difficulty conceiving. It's been a while. It's been, 6 months or a year, and I haven't been able to do it. And I know that I need to get my eating, quote unquote, under control because I think my binging is preventing me from getting pregnant. And then oftentimes we'll do the work of intuitive eating. And I think one of the things that I really like to focus on is to take the stigma off the binging and take the onus off the binging and say, like, let's look at the restricting. Let's look at the diet culture thinking that's contributing, that's driving this relationship with food that ends up in binging, but it doesn't start there. Binging is just kind of a natural outcome of the cycle of restriction. And so once we kind of go through that process and heal someone's relationship with food where they're not restricting anymore, even if they're still occasionally binging, but oftentimes the binging goes way down because the restriction has gone way down. I've had this happen a number of times where people will suddenly, after several months of this work, of intuitive eating work, get pregnant on their own. I don't have stats on that or a scientific study on that for my clinical practice as to whether that's just anecdotal, but I definitely know other providers who've said the same thing. And it is true that when people are restricting, their fertility goes down, right? Their period, oftentimes their periods aren't as regular, they don't have periods, or hormonal balance is just off, and that can definitely contribute to infertility and difficulty conceiving. So I think it's really interesting that doctors are always telling people in larger bodies to lose weight, quote unquote, in order to get pregnant. And in fact, that might be exactly the opposite of what they need. This pressure to lose weight equals pressure to restrict and pressure to starve themselves. And that level of restriction actually makes it less likely to be able to get pregnant because your body needs to have adequate fuel coming in so that it knows it's in a situation of food abundance rather than a situation of famine so that it can feel safe in order to reproduce.
That's it. It needs to know it's in a safe environment to be able to sustain a pregnancy, right? But it's really interesting that you talk about that because I'm starting to piece together in my mind of all the different things I've been reading around the possibility that maybe malnourishment is actually causing irregular menstruation in these people, and maybe PCOS has a root in being malnourished, especially for people in bigger bodies where you're like, whoa, well, they can't be malnourished because they're in a bigger body. And obviously atypical anorexia is a classic example of where that's missed and not diagnosed so many times, because we don't see anorexic people as people in bigger bodies. So I really believe that there could be a link there between people being malnourished in bigger bodies and that contributing or some way playing a part in their irregularity in their menstrual cycle and subfertility.
What have you seen in your clients? Do you see this a lot in people that you work with too?
Yeah, because like you say, they're in this phase of binging and restricting, and that obviously impacts their metabolism as well. So then they're kind of in this place of not being able to refuel efficiently and kind of get the nourishment that they need. And when they start to loosen that grip and really find ways of supporting themselves with food and making sure that they are well nourished and really getting the fuel that they need, things start to happen. And so many people even people I've not worked with, but have just been reading my work, have reported and said, I've been reading your stuff and, I've really just started to look after myself and stop doing this restricting, and it's had such a huge impact, and I'm pregnant. And, it's just such a phenomenal thing to see that once people have let go of this idea of they need to lose weight and they can actually just be in their bodies and they don't have to do anything or lose weight or restrict calories or anything, then once they've got over that, then it's, things happen and babies are made. It's just wonderful.
It is amazing how that happens, right? The giving up of the restriction has so many benefits to life in general and even to creating a new life, if that's what you're wanting to do, That's
it. And I just love the idea that these people are then passing this on to their children. So they are embodying this kind of just being okay in their bodies and intuitively eating and then passing that gift on to their children.
I know. It's amazing. I wish we could have a whole generation raised like this, like that we could just eradicate diet culture starting now and like see how much different of a place the world would be without it.
Oh, it would be amazing.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about your work and Fat Positive Fertility, the book, and also your courses and the work that you do with clients. Like, how did you come to the philosophy that you have on this? How did you come to a place of fat positivity and applying that to fertility?
So it really came through my own personal need for something after giving up dieting. So I made myself promises that I didn't want to weigh myself anymore and I wasn't going to go on a diet anymore. And then I was left with this huge hole in my life. I all of a sudden had this energy that I never really realized I was missing. And I was like, oh my God, this is life. Colors are brighter, things look different. And then I was like, okay, well, now I need to navigate this space of being in a bigger body without giving up these excuses of, but I'm losing weight this way, or I'm going to the gym and doing this, or, trying to find ways of being a good fatty. And that's when I discovered Health at Every Size movement on Instagram. And I kind of really just created this little bubble for myself of following all these incredible people who are doing this amazing work. And it just felt like this tiny little safe place where it was okay to be me. And I could just kind of revel in the inspiration of these people just being unapologetically themselves and sharing these wonderful photos of their bodies, just being bodies. And it was phenomenal. And then I just kind of realized that I needed to support these people. I needed to work in this field. So I was absorbing all these ideas and absorbing all these ways of like how I could support people. I'd already done all my coaching. I had this great knowledge base, but then I realized that I couldn't really use some of the frameworks in the right way and things, people in bigger bodies just had different challenges. So I really had a kind of huge brainstorming session and really narrowed it down for really important things that I realized that people in bigger bodies needed support in. And this goes in terms of fertility, but it also works in terms of pregnancy and kind of in general. And those kind of four main areas were formulating a healthcare plan that didn't revolve around weight loss and dieting. So really figuring out for people what health meant to them and what they wanted their health to look like, and really breaking down how they could reach that. So whether they wanted more energy, or whether they needed more sleep, or whether they just, wanted to feel more vibrant or lift heavier weights, or whatever it looked like for them, just really finding a way to support them on that without, taking away the diet culture side of health and how we look at our health. Then the next kind of pillar was in terms of advocacy, because people in bigger bodies really need, and I wish they didn't, but really need to be able to go to their healthcare providers and ask for what they need and make sure that they're being able to have these really difficult conversations. And they take a lot of energy and they take a lot of focus, and we don't always have the spoons necessary for doing these difficult conversations, but just giving them the tools to be able to go into an appointment and ask for the tests and have those really difficult conversations and argue with their healthcare professionals, which they might never have had to do before, just to make sure that they're getting the treatment that they deserve. And then the other two were around trust. So relearning how to trust your body, which again feeds back into intuitive eating, of really just being able to check in with your body again and listening to the cues and the things that your body's trying to tell you, and just, even just simple hunger signals about, really listening to what your body needs and wants and honoring that. And also completely being okay with making other choices and what your mental health needs, and knowing that it's okay to make other choices if things aren't accessible to you at the moment. So just kind of really tuning into that intuition again. And then the final one was around creating positive mindset. So really supporting and delving deep into what your beliefs are around getting pregnant and what that means for you, and how you can, all the crazy thoughts you have going on in your head round and round every day about how you're not good enough to be a mom, and how you can't never get pregnant, and how everybody tells you that you're being irresponsible to get pregnant. It's just about kind of switching those around so that you can support your mental health as well, in terms of, setting yourself up for the best possible situation in which to get pregnant.
Well, yeah, because as we were just talking about, that mindset of feeling like you're irresponsible, or you're never going to get pregnant, or there's something wrong with you, is just going to lead to greater stress and take you further away from that goal of pregnancy. If you're putting that stress on your body, that cortisol that is flooding your system does have an effect.
Yeah. And it's internalized weight stigma. It's, you beating yourself up because of the way that you've been told you should be. And it's something that I think we all will benefit from moving away from.
Oh, yes. Yeah. If we could eradicate internalized weight stigma and external weight stigma, which causes internalized weight stigma, I think the world would be a tremendously better place.
Oh, if only.
In terms of that advocacy piece and advocating for yourself at the doctor, I would love to hear some tips that you might have for any listeners who are pregnant or thinking of becoming pregnant, trying to conceive, and maybe struggling with fertility issues, because I definitely get questions like that fairly often from people who want to know what are alternatives to the sort of standard medical advice to just lose weight in order to get pregnant. Because the people who ask me these questions generally know that's not going to work for them or that hasn't worked for them and they want a different way. So what are some strategies and tools that people can use in advocating for themselves at the doctor's office to get what they need?
I could talk about this for hours. I love this topic. So the first thing that I recommend is choosing the healthcare professional if you can. So making sure that if you have the ability to choose a healthcare professional, researching and choosing one that's going to support your body. I mean, there are FAT positive and HAES aligned doctors out there and reproductive endocrinologists. So if you can find them in your area, ask your fat friends or go on some of these kind of Facebook groups to support fat bodies and just really see if you can find someone that's going to support you. That will be the easiest way for you to get the care that you need. If that's not accessible to you or you cannot find someone in your area, then it's a case of kind of knuckling down on the research. So getting yourself a notebook, writing down a list of all the questions you've got, all the tests and treatments that you think you want to explore with your doctor or that you feel like would be helpful for you, and then getting some research together to support any possible kind of arguments that your doctor might have. So for my clients, I have resources that they can take in with them. So we have a resource about how IVF is actually fine for anybody in any size BMI, and the research actually supports that it was equally effective among all BMIs. We have a research document around how dieting doesn't work. So if they say, just lose weight, then okay, well, dieting doesn't work. So let's have an alternative, please. There's just really arming yourself with the facts that you have and the research papers that are out there to support you in your arguments. So it's about being prepared around that. Some really useful, practical, easy tips that you can go in with is that you can refuse to be weighed, which is also a really nice one if it's triggering for you. The only reason that you need to be weighed is for things like anesthetic. So if you're going in for an anesthetic, then they'll need your weight for your dosage. But apart from that, there's no medical reason why they'd need to weigh you.
And is that true even in pregnancy, even for people who are pregnant? Or
Yes.
That's really interesting because I feel like I've heard conflicting information on that. And I know people who have successfully had pregnancies where they were not weighed and they had other ways of measuring the baby. But I think it might be a case by case depending on your doctor, I guess, as to whether that's going to be allowed.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing we have to remember is that it's our body. So we get to choose. They have to ask you to be weighed. They have to get your consent to go through that procedure, even if it's simple as just weighing you. So, they can measure you with a tape measure, or they can use a scan to look at, baby's size. There are other ways that they can do it. And if weight is going to be triggering for you, if you're recovering from an eating disorder, or, for any reason you don't want to be weighed, that is your choice. You do not have to step on those scales. And I think it's just a really empowering fact. They cannot do anything to you. They cannot force you to birth in a hospital. They cannot make you do this. They cannot make you do that. It's your decision. It's your body. And although we have this dynamic in our healthcare system of the doctor is at this top of this hierarchy and we're at the bottom and we just do as we're told, we need to even out that playing field and realize that we are equal partners in making our healthcare decisions.
I think that's such great advice generally across the board, right? And I often say too, your doctor works for you, not the other way around. So
yes,
you're allowed to hire and fire them. And I know for sure that can be complicated depending on your insurance, the healthcare system you're in, et cetera. But you're still not beholden to what the doctor says, and you are entitled to a second opinion, third, fourth, fifth, sixth opinion. You're entitled to find a doctor who actually is going to help you and listen to your concerns and approach things in a way that's going to be health promoting for you. Because I think I think a lot of this goes back to what's going to promote overall truly holistic well-being, right? Like, I think doctors and other healthcare providers who don't understand the nuances of that and who don't understand mental health are so quick to recommend supposed physical health interventions that might not even be true health promoting interventions, like weight loss, which we know is not actually a health promoting intervention, but which they think is, and which focuses exclusively on the physical without considering what the effects are going to be on your mental health.
Yeah, and you can always ask for the evidence behind the recommendations that they make. So if they recommend weight loss, or if they recommend some kind of health promoting behavior, you can ask them for the research, and they should be able to back that up, because we are in an evidence-based medical system. So they should have the things there to support what they recommend. And if they don't, then you can be asking them, okay, well, what other things are evidence-based, and what other things, a great question is, what other things would you recommend for someone in a smaller body? So you can get full access to all the different options and the recommendations. Because if you don't have full access to every test, every treatment that might be possible or useful in your situation, then how can you make an informed decision about your healthcare?
And yeah, informed consent is a requirement too. People have to be informed of what their options are and give consent, not just be sort of railroaded into a treatment.
Exactly.
Anything else that you like to recommend people to tell doctors or use to stand up for themselves in treatment?
Yeah, my absolute favorite one is if they say no, or if they tell you that you're not allowed this or you can't have that, is to tell them to write it down in your notes. So make sure they document it, because that can change things when you ask them to do that.
Interesting. That means it's going to be seen, it's going to potentially be audited, right? That like they're accountable to someone else looking at that note.
And the responsibility then falls onto them. And then if it was further down the line that if you'd have had that test, that would have picked this up, and now it's later, there is a chain of evidence there to support that you asked for this test, and then they become liable. So once they realize that they will become liable for that, then often it's easier for them to say, okay, well, we'll just do the test, or we'll just do this treatment, or it changes the dynamic drastically.
That's so interesting. I mean, because the calculus really becomes sort of the cost of doing the treatment, which I think is why the cost and maybe the labor of it, or fears about body size that aren't really founded, sort of making them risk averse. And then basically when you're saying, write this down in my notes, you're asking them to weigh those perceived costs against the potential cost of a lawsuit, of you suing them down the line because they didn't do something that would have helped and, would have saved you from whatever might come up.
That's it.
I think once that threat is looming, right, it becomes like, okay, that potential cost outweighs any of these perceived more immediate costs.
And it seems like a ridiculous measure to take, but, if this is the card that you have to play to get the treatment that you need, I think it's a good card to play.
Very good card. Yeah, I think the fact that we live in kind of a litigious and cost-conscious medical system, healthcare system, at least in the Western world. I mean, I don't know how it is in the UK versus the US. I know that the UK has a nationalized healthcare system, so it might be slightly different there. But, in the US, certainly it's very, very litigious and very cost conscious. So I think that will carry a lot of sway here for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's quite similar here in terms of your doctor is limited by what they can prescribe, but at the same time, because we have an NHS, it's not a cost on them, or not on a cost on like your insurance, because that's not applicable. So I think it definitely has a lot of sway here too, because it's just easier for them to say yes than it is to then have that on their record.
Right. Yeah. And the potential for malpractice that comes up. Yeah. That's so interesting. I'm curious, too, to hear more about the research on IVF, in vitro fertilization, and body size, because that is one thing, I've definitely heard a number of clients be denied IVF or told that they wouldn't be eligible for IVF, despite the research that you're talking about that says there isn't really any difference. So why do people why do doctors and healthcare facilities bar people in larger bodies from getting IVF? And what can you do if you're someone who has had that barrier put up against you?
So I would say there is more research that supports that IVF is quote unquote bad for people in bigger bodies, but I found 4 to 5 studies now that actually show that there is no difference. Like whatever BMI size you are, IVF is just as effective. And I think the problem, like we were talking about before, is that IVF has become an industry. So it's the clinics now, and how they sell themselves to people is based on their pregnancy rates. So any perception that they have that this is going to make their pregnancy rates worse, then they can just put barriers in place to stop those people coming to their clinic. And I think from a sales perspective, they really want just the best people to come to their clinic so they get the best pregnancy rates, so that then they can, advertise that, and they're like the best clinic in whatever state, or, that's how it works for them because they're a business and they need to create revenue for themselves. So although actually the more and more research is now coming out that it doesn't make a difference, it's this perception that it makes a difference. It's this idea that, in the fat-phobic research that there is an issue. It's that idea that it's a problem that I think puts off a lot of clinics. And it's the same in the UK. We have a BMI barrier of about to access free IVF cycles. And there's kind of very little wiggle room around that. But if you're in that position, you can advocate for yourself. And I've been working with clients who have successfully advocated against this barrier because we know BMI is rubbish. This barrier is completely arbitrary. There's no reason why somebody on the BMI scale is going to have a different result from somebody who's it's completely arbitrary. So I think it is possible to advocate against those barriers and to have a really good argument as to why they're absolutely rubbish. But it's changing the culture and changing the policies around these private companies that can basically do whatever they want. So it's a slow wave of change, but hopefully that wave of change is coming.
And the fact that they are private companies, I think, is interesting because that makes it the fear that they have around litigation might be greater in some ways than if it was a nationalized company or something. So you can sort of use that leverage there maybe pretty effectively. And just so interesting to think about the fact that it's just about the money, basically. It's just about their quote unquote success rates, the fear, the perception that their success rates would go down if they treated people in larger bodies, and therefore they would lose money because they would lose that prestige and that ability to use the high success rates on their sales pages. And it's just so shady that is the case. It's just yet another example of business being fat phobic because they're afraid that helping fat people is going to affect their bottom line. We see this with clothing companies, with terrible companies like Abercrombie and Fitch or whatever being like, well, we don't want people above a certain size wearing our clothes because that would dilute our brand or some bullshit. It's like, that kind of corporate greed and fat phobic thinking is exactly what we need to fight against and dismantle. That seems like what is showing up in the fertility world and the IVF world in some way too. It's like we don't want fat people sort of clouding the perception that we are a successful treatment center. So we're just going to keep them from coming in the door.
And I think, again, as well, another kind of factor plays into it is they're not set up for bigger bodies. Like maybe their skills aren't as, you need a different skill set to be able to perform these things on bigger bodies. You need even different chairs and different treatment beds and different BP cuffs, blood pressure cuffs, and you need to set up appropriately for bigger bodies. And some people just aren't willing to do that. So I feel like, maybe that has a role to play as well, that it's this huge inconvenience to have to set up a clinic room that supports people in bigger bodies, which again is just so absolutely ridiculous.
And it's the product of diet culture too, right? It's the product of fat phobia that they haven't felt the need to set things up in that way, to prioritize people in larger bodies, because it's sort of, people in larger bodies are sort of an afterthought.
And they quote unquote did it to themselves, right? It's their own fault. So why should we have to upskill ourselves in learning how to support these bodies?
Ugh, I know. It's the worst. I'm curious to know some tips that you might have around people who are listening who are thinking about getting pregnant or trying to get pregnant prior to like going to a doctor and trying to get treatment for fertility, but, a little worried maybe about their fertility and hoping to maximize it and improve their chances of getting pregnant. What are some like kind of self-help steps people can take?
Definitely getting the intuitive eating book is really supportive, or doing your course, or finding a way of really, really focusing on your relationship with food and how that's impacting you. And even just getting a little bit curious about, the way that you're showing up and the decisions you're making around your health and your well-being, and what that looks like when you're not weighing yourself or on a diet, and, really what that looks like. And I think one of the most important things you can do is surround yourself with positive plus size pregnancy. So a great easy way to do this is to kind of go on Instagram and follow like a hashtag plus size pregnancy, and you'll just see rows and rows of beautiful people with beautiful pregnant bodies. And once you can start to like see yourself in that and see other people who are a similar sized body to you achieving that and having, these incredible pregnancies and children and births, I think it just opens your mind to that possibility, and having that possibility open is so powerful.
It is huge, right? Because it's not at all what we see. And for people who've been constantly shamed and, grown up in this culture that is always stigmatizing larger bodies, it can feel like the truth, capital T, that larger bodies are just not able to get pregnant, or larger bodies are not going to support a healthy pregnancy or sustain a pregnancy, or that pregnancy and fertility just aren't for them, that it's just not for you if you have a larger body. And that's just bullshit. Like, that is just diet culture bullshit that has fed us. It has fed all of us. And that is so hard not to internalize, especially when you're in a larger body. But yeah, countering that messaging is so important.
And we don't see people in bigger bodies pregnant represented in the media at all. Like, I can't even remember the last time I saw it, without specifically looking for it on like niche websites. You don't see that in the media. So just surrounding yourselves with those images and making that part of your like things that you see daily, it really kind of normalizes it and makes it realistic and achievable for you.
Yeah, that's huge. And seeing how people look in pregnant bodies and plus size bodies too, I think goes a long way towards dealing with some of the body image issues that can come up in pregnancy, which I know are numerous because everyone in this culture has been conditioned to fear getting larger, and that's going to be what happens in pregnancy. So I think we all have some body image work to do around pregnancy oftentimes.
Yeah, and bigger bodies look different when they're pregnant. And again, because we don't see that, we don't know what to expect. And we feel like, oh, my pregnant body looks wrong because it doesn't look like your typical kind of normal body, then a bump kind of thing. And it's just, it really messes with your mind because you don't know how your body's supposed to look pregnant. And seeing the multitude of different ways that your body can look pregnant, whatever size it is just, it's so reaffirming, and it's just so normalizing, and it just creates this space where you're okay to be okay, and it's normal and it's fine, and it's kind of reduces some of that anxiety around it.
How did it affect you body image wise with your pregnancies? How did you come to relate to your body in pregnancy?
In my first pregnancy, so I've had 2 pregnancies. My first one, I was in fear the whole time. I didn't know what my body was going to look like. It didn't really feel like I was pregnant for maybe the first 4 or 5 months. I didn't really feel pregnant. And again, that kind of fed into my anxieties around, oh my gosh, is the baby stopped growing? Has this happened? Has that happened? Has something gone wrong? So that was really quite a scary time for me. But I remember really vividly not wanting to have my picture taken because I didn't feel good in my body. It just felt wrong, and clothes didn't fit, but I didn't want to buy new clothes because I was still in that mentality of, well, I can't buy bigger clothes because that means X, Y, Z about me. And the whole relationship you have with buying smaller and bigger clothes when you're in a bigger body is it just feels like something, I can't believe somebody would see me with this clothes size on, even though they absolutely don't care at all.
Yeah, or then they'll probably never see the tag on your clothes.
That's it. It's ridiculous. But in my second pregnancy, I felt, I got bigger quicker because obviously things are stretched out a bit more at that time. And I just felt more at ease in my body with the second one because I'd been able to have a successful first pregnancy. I kind of knew more what it was about. And also I had a tiny toddler to run after, so I wasn't as kind of hyper focused on my body in the same way that I was with the first one, when I was just kind of going through life as normal, not realizing the tornado that was about to hit. I felt a lot calmer and a lot easier the second time around because I knew what to expect, right? I knew the shape that my body was going to be and that it was going to be okay, that it didn't look as pregnant as other people. And I still just looked fat, but just fatter. And, all these different things that I was worried about the first time around, I just kind of just got on with it the second time around. And it was a lot easier, definitely.
That really helps to know you've been through it before and you can do it again. Probably help build your confidence in your body's abilities to do it too.
Definitely. And I think we're made to fear our bodies are going to be, automatically they're going to do something wrong or be wrong in some way. But just having that trust in it was so reassuring the second time around. I just wish I'd been able to trust it in the same way the first time.
Yeah, because it sounds like it was a very anxious experience the first time.
Mm-hmm. And that should be a special time for people who are pregnant. We shouldn't be made to feel anxious. And I just, I wish that for everybody who gets pregnant in a bigger body, that they are in a place where they can enjoy it and not feel so anxious and stressed about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think your work is helping so much to create that sense of trust and that sense of possibility. And I really love what you're doing and putting out there because you're sharing an amazing alternative to all the fear mongering that we hear about what it means to be pregnant in a larger body.
Thank you. I really hope it's helping people to just realize that it's more for fat people to get pregnant.
Yeah. I mean, you're such a great example of that. And all the work you do, I think, helps reinforce that. And I have had multiple requests to have you on the podcast. So I know it's helping. I know people are resonating with your work. So yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, tell us where people can find you and learn more about your work and, buy the book and get the courses and all of that stuff.
So I'm mainly on Instagram and my handle is FAT+ve Fertility. My website is nicolasalmon.co.uk and my book is available on Amazon and it's called Fat and Fertile. I do have a couple of courses, which are the main one is the Fertility Undiet, which is like an anti-diet for everybody who's kind of sick of fertility diets. And then I'm taking one-to-one clients at the moment as well.
Amazing. We'll put all those links in the show notes too, so people can find you and click on through to your work. And thank you so much again for being here. This was really a wonderful conversation. I'm excited to share all these resources with people.
Thank you so much for having me, Christy.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Nicola Salmon for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/237. That's christyharrison.com/237. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. And I want to say thanks to my family friend, Alan, who just passed away, for encouraging me to perform, encouraging me to do shows and nurture that performance instinct in me. I'm so grateful to him for his support for that. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.